Thank you very much. Thank you. It's really nice to be here. I said it this morning, but it bears repeating. The hospitality and the warmth of the Biola community has really been extraordinary to me. And really, quite honestly, the piece would not have come together without a lot of generosity, prayers, I'm sure. At least in Dan's case, I know Dan was praying. So I'm really very glad to be here and glad to have the piece here, and really honored to have a piece of sculpture here on this campus. Tonight, what I want to do is to walk through sort of 2.5 things. First, I'm going to show the way the piece was made, both sort of thinking conceptually, but also thinking in terms of the actual physical making of the piece. The second thing is I'm going to try to relate the piece or situate it within a larger body of my work. And I went back and had old slides, and you'll see they're old, that were actually from my graduate days, and I had them scanned and digitized so that I could put a couple, I don't have a lot, but put a couple in here, which was an interesting exercise for me. I thought I would do it just because I was thinking if students were here, it's always good to sort of see what changes and what doesn't change. And then the half is I'm going to pose a question that I've spent a great deal of time thinking about, and I'm not going to really open it up very much, but would just throw it out there to for discussion and maybe rile people up a little bit. So this is the creation of True Vine, and it began really very close to the end of 2013 when Lauren Baker contacted me and asked me if I would make a proposal. And after Lauren's death, then Dan very graciously picked up on that. And so I made the proposal, I think, in January, and by March of 2014, I was informed that I was one of 2 artists that were going to be making work. This is a cover page for the original proposal, and what I wanted to establish with the proposal and the pictures there was that there's a long history of vine imagery based both on textual and just, I think, pure visual things in the history of the church, in the history of Western art. So on the left there, you have a sarcophagus from the catacombs, and on the right, you have a Greek icon from the 16th century, both of them working with vine imagery and both of them referencing Christ in different ways. Then when I sent in my work, this is a piece that I did in 2008 that's been really popular. I've gotten a lot of good feedback on this, and actually Cairn University, which is the old Philadelphia Biblical University, has this and one other piece of mine with an option to buy, which is very different than the way you folks work. But this is called Straight Line to Heaven. It's about 20 feet tall, and it's made of apple limbs, and from what I understand, Mrs. Long was taken with this piece, and I just knew that a lot of other people had responded to it very well. And so when I made the proposal for the site, which I thought was going to be at the opposite the Green Gallery, right outside there where Tom, and I always butcher his last name, so I'll just say Tom's piece is, this was one of the things that I proposed. When I got the, when I was looking into doing the commission, one of my first things was, what material am I going to use? I was not at all sure. My first choice would have been bronze, just because of its durability, but I didn't think that I could afford bronze. I thought that I might do something like this in sheet bronze and then hammer and forge it, cut it up into sheets and hammer and forge it. So this was sort of in the back of my mind as one potential thing, but then when I came to Biola and met Dan in March, he said, well, we've got another site for you. And this was a picture I made at the time of the site, which initially I was a little bit skeptical about, and Dan remembers that morning, I'm sure I said, well, what about over here? And what about over here? And he was very diplomatic and sort of steered me back to the white rectangle. And there were two things that really sort of convinced me that it was the thing to work with. One was the fact, and I had no clue, that when I titled the piece True Vine, I had no clue that the Talbot Building existed and that the Talbot Building had scripture verses on it, let alone something from John, John 15. So that was a sort of like, maybe it belongs here. And the second thing is that the more I looked at the building, I was first struck by the cruciform image, which to me, I've worked a lot with cross imagery because I find it an intriguing thing, and as just a little parentheses here, something that could use a serious update visually. And so I thought, okay, I can work with that. And the other thing was, it reminded me of some of the work of the early Russian constructivists, and particularly Casimir Milevich. And he was influenced by Orthodox icons. As a matter of fact, the painting on the right is a Russian Orthodox cross form, and then on the left he has one of these marvelously minimal things. But he used cross imagery a lot, and so that kind of clicked in my head. And if you look at that red, that's a pretty intense red, And so I thought, okay, red, black, and white, and particularly with a predominance of white. So I was very interested in that. So I came back. Dan said, well, of course, we got to see something. So I came back to Pennsylvania, and I made this little model of the site. But I was trying to work with color. I was trying to work with scale, those kinds of things. And so I sent this to Dan, and he very politely said, well, the committee feels it's a little minimal. I realized, oops, I shot myself in the foot because I thought I was just proposing a rough idea and not a specific thing. So once we ironed out things, I said, sure, I'm going to be really glad to change that. That wasn't meant to be, the final iteration of the idea, but just the idea itself in terms of the relationship of the branch form to essentially the canvas behind it. Then I started to build. And the origins of this are in an apple orchard that's about 5 miles from my home, just a beautiful apple orchard that my wife painted when we first moved there in the 1980s. And now, of course, if you look in the background there, you can see has been cut and is being developed, and just houses are squeezed in almost as tight as they are in the valley here, So I was gathering wood. This was a guy that worked with me, a wonderful former student of mine, and we spent about 3 to 4 weeks out in the orchard cutting. We cut about 2,500 feet of limbs. There's a partial arrangement of the limbs as we had them outside, and we're sorting them. And I needed to do two things. One is I needed to strip the bark off them, and I needed to dry them. And so the commission, and this was not for this job. This was for a commission I was working on for Messiah College, which was a large commission where also the president of the college said, we really love Straight Line to Heaven. Can you do something like Straight Line to Heaven? And I said, no, I don't think I can. But I worked with the architects and everything, and we did this other thing that I'm going to show you a little later on. So this is the process of getting the material ready. And once it was dried, I sorted it. And I essentially had 4 categories. I had Ys, elbows, and arcs. And then I had a big category of don't know what to call it. Irregulars, which was probably the biggest pile. But I still have, for the Messiah piece, which I'm going to show you in a little bit, it was about just under 250 lineal feet of limbs. So I've got quite an inventory left. And I needed to have that because you can't go out looking for the perfect limb in an orchard. You just need to have a huge sort of stockpile to work with. And the way I work is, in this instance, I mapped out the gallery, excuse me, not the gallery, I mapped out the side of the building on my studio floor, and I just spent time composing there. Just, you know, how would this look, how would this look, how would this feel? You can see in the background there on the right top corner, there's a stepladder. I'd get up on stepladders and I look down, I'd move the stepladder around, I'd lie down on the floor to see how it would look, you know, from the side, just working as much as possible to get the composition. So if I back up for a minute, you'll see that this earlier sort of design right here, which is the base, where the thing closest to the bottom of the screen is the base, became this. I put another small form in there that there's that kind of arm coming out for a couple of reasons. One was because I thought it needed it dynamically, but I think another reason was for support. I wanted something that would be structural. This is that arm being refined, and I did a lot of measuring, and I also did something because we were in a tremendous hurry doing this, because we had to get it to bronze casters in San Jose, and that's another part of the story that I didn't mention, but we had to get it to them very quickly. So I used body putty, and I consider body putty, you know, sort of a sculptural sin. I mean, you shouldn't use body putty unless you're Richard Prince and you're doing cars, you know, that you're covering with body putty. That would be one thing, but not for me. I had two wonderful studio assistants, Madison Vanderark, a junior at Messiah College. I've known her since she was 8 years old, so we've had a long just friendship, and Casey Fletcher on the right, who's a senior at Messiah College, and so they worked carefully and consistently with me, and we built this whole thing in roughly about 5 weeks' time, which for me is just hyper fast. I mean, I have pieces of sculpture that I work on for years, so I was kind of amazed. I set this up in the studio against the wall there, had that taped out for the bottom portion, and then I built a wall so that Dan could see, because I sent all of this to him, and then he shared it with the committee, I think the Public Art Committee here. So this was the top portion. And then we had discussed about having a little piece that's around the corner there. Once that was done, everything was disassembled for in shapes that were easily castable and burned out in a kiln, because I was fortunate enough to find two guys in San Jose, a sculptor that I know said, talk to these guys that would cast it in bronze. And so I talked earlier about the fact that I was unsure about the material, but I was really thrilled when I found these two guys. So I boxed up, took everything apart, made it so they could just make molds and burn it out, do the bronze casting, and so I shipped them 2 crates like this, and they also hustled. They thought they were going to have 8 to 9 weeks, and they had 4 to 5 weeks, and so they were really burning the midnight oil. This is just a little overview of what they did. It's one of the forms there where essentially they're making a mold. They have a soft latex mold that would go right up against the form and take all the detail, and then that's held in a mother mold of plaster. When they're done with that, they put the wax in the molds, and these are the waxes, and trying to shoot for about 1/4 of an inch thick wall surface. And they told me it was a real learning curve for them in order to get that, particularly in the small, when you're working in something in this diameter, to try and get it so it's still hollow was a real trick for them. These were put in investment, which is essentially plaster and sand, put in the burnout kiln that burned out all of the wax. After that's done, they put these forms in a sand pit, and so that they're held together by sand, and they pour the bronze into that. When the piece comes out of the bronze, comes out of the investment, it looks like on the left there, so there's a lot of handwork to be done called chasing. They had to cut off all the sprues and gates. They had to clean up the seam lines, and on the right there you can see everything cleaned and ready to weld. And then they welded the entire thing together. I sent them very careful plans about layout, plus a whole bunch of pictures that they had for reference. And that's a little bit of a crapshoot, really, because you know, they're out there, I'm here, you know, Biola's down here, and is it all going to work out? But they were very, very fine craftsmen, and they did a great job of working on it. I showed up in late September after my granddaughter in San Francisco was born, rented a truck, we wrapped the work up. That's the studio at San Jose State. There it is in the truck, and I drove it down here. Now, one of the things that I've talked about a little bit was color. And I initially intended to patina it. Now I have some, I don't consider myself a bronze expert at all, but I have some experience in patinaing things, but I knew I wanted a red color. And so this is taken off of YouTube, and there's a man that makes a lot of patinas and has demonstration videos, and this is about as red as things get with patinas. And I was a little distressed when I started to really explore that, and so I talked to the two casting guys, and they said, oh, well, you just supplement it with auto engine enamel because it's something that can be heated. When you're patinaing something, you're essentially using different chemicals and putting heat on it to get it to quickly react with the chemical nature of the bronze. And they said, but you can't get a really good red without using auto engine enamel. And so I was kind of meditating on that. Plus, then they said, we've got one day to do this. And I was just like, one day? This isn't going to work. You know, I'm going to need to do something else. So I talked it over with Dan, and he said, sure, you can, you know, we can explore paint job. So I drove down here. I had one day to work here on it, and I had a ticket from LAX back to Harrisburg the next day. So we had to find somebody to paint it in one day. So Dan and I prayed about it, and we found a guy online, a body shop. Dan said to me, you know, no worries, this is low rider culture, we'll find somebody around here. And so we went to this body shop, and we said, oh, we saw these wonderful cars online in your body shop. And he said, they're not mine. He said, somebody else did those. I just have them on my website. So he said, the guy you want to go see is Tom Rodriguez. And Tom Rodriguez, this doesn't look very impressive. He actually has a collision shop that's very impressive, that does, you know, all of the accident work. But his heart and his reputation is really in custom cars and restoration and things like that. And so this is where the piece ended up. I took him pictures on my iPad, said, here's what it is, can you paint it? And he said, yeah, I can paint that, no problem. I said, well, can you paint it next January, February? And he said, yeah, probably, you know. And sitting right where that chair is, in front of the doors of the spray booth, was a Thunderbird that had been painted a bright red color. 1955 Thunderbird, one of the cars that I loved when I was a kid growing up. And this is his shop. I think I've said this before, but I loved hot rods when I was growing up. And I grew up outside of Boston, you know, and I knew hot rod culture is really, really Southern California. And I subscribed to Hot Rod magazine. I had all of that. And so you see those framed pictures over there in the background of this shop. Those are all magazine covers from hot rod and custom car magazines from the 80s and the 90s and things. And I was like, yeah, this guy's really good, because they were his cars on the cover of them, because he was considered one of the best. And it was confirmed for me when I asked him, I said, well, somebody I used to read about a lot was Ed Big Daddy Roth. And he said, I said, did you know him? And he said, oh yeah, I used to have him come in and stripe cars and put flame jobs on them and everything. And I thought, okay, this is it. This is the guy. So we referred to this as Ferrari red, the color. And here it is in the booth down here. And you can see that it's not really Ferrari red. It's a little bit darker. That's a 2010 Ferrari Italiano up there. If you type into Google Ferrari red, you'll get these kind of differences in terms of things. Ferrari red's actually a little more red-orange than what's on the piece. And that's the bottom there is, he's spraying it actually, Tom, as you can see him over there behind the big trunk for him, and he's spraying it. We had to let it cure for roughly 6 days, and when I came back to pick it up, the piece, they had already wrapped it up in the paper, and the thing that I loved is that this is a 1932 Ford body that they were working on. And you know, the 1932 Ford, when I was growing up, was considered the Ne Plus Ultra. It was the Ferrari of hot rods. You know, you couldn't have anything better than that. So I thought, yes, sir, once again, I love it. You know, it's right here. The installation, we had pre-fit the piece on the building, and so the holes were all drilled and everything, and the crew, the Biola ground crew helped me with this, and it was just really, they were terrific. So here it is. You can see that it's banded to the building and it's epoxied into the building. Every place that it touches, there's a 3-inch long stainless steel threaded rod, 3/4 of an inch thick, that goes in, and then the hole is filled with epoxy. So it should really stay there a while. I think you would have to do some violence to the piece to get it out of the building at this point. And one of my major concerns was, how does it look from different angles? And as I've been walking around the thing and really looking at it, I've been quite pleased with the way it works. I think it really interacts with the form. Now that's all process work, but I was concerned also with the theology that was here, not wanting to make a sort of, you know, a slogan, but I wanted to embody in some way something that I thought was central to the faith. And one of the things in being a Christian is finding out that there's no guarantee. You know, I used to tell students we would pray at the beginning of every year in my sculpture classes that we wouldn't have accidents, because, you know, there are a lot of ways you can really seriously hurt yourself. And I'm thankful to say that in 36 years of teaching, I took a couple of kids to the emergency room, but it was never really bad. But I told kids, it's not an insurance policy, you know, and there's no guarantee that the Christian life is going to be easy. And so I wanted to some way make it work with that cross form, right where those crosshairs were, as though the form were entering that solid and coming out, and at the place that it had entered, there had been the participation in Christ's suffering and the full Christian life, because to remain with Christ means to be open in that, I think. At least that's the way I interpreted that. So that's the piece. Now, very quickly, I wanted to show you some other things of mine, and you know, I once heard the great sculptor David Smith say, well, I really thought I was changing a great deal. But he said, but when I went back and looked at my work, he said, I thought maybe I changed about that much. And I think a lot of people think that they're doing really radical things, but if you look at their work carefully, you oftentimes see these continuities. And so I went back and I made slides of my graduate thesis show, which was in 1970, which gives you an idea of how long ago that was. This is an 8-foot-long bar, or flat about this thick, 8 feet long, that I took to a professional sharpening shop and had it sharpened to a razor edge. Now, ideally, I would not have had the plexiglass box around it, because I wanted to have real threat in it. However, Maryland Institute was wise enough to say that's not a good idea. So we compromised on the plexiglass box. But you can see I have a picture up there of, you know, the sharpness of it. It was really quite sharp. Just as a little footnote, I was not a Christian when I made this piece. After I became a Christian, it really nagged at me. And I was in Switzerland for a long time, and this was in storage. And when I got back, I got out a grinder and I just ground it down. You know, so there's some change in the sort of continuity that I'm talking about. But it's very much, it's a sight piece, but it also at least implies your senses. And one of the things that I think of when I think of substance is, you know, the sensory aspect of things. So I've made a lot of crosses out of salt, thinking that we could maybe use an update from sheep and use cows instead, and trying to sort of picture what the relationship of the believer to the cross is. Now, one of the things about salt that's really fascinating to me as just an imagistic thing is it's both a preservative and a corrosive agent. And the rust on this is the last one I've done. I did it about 2 years ago for somebody asked me to make one. And the rust is from the saliva of the cows, so it works. I mean, they're getting nutrient out of it, but at the same time, it's not all good. It's not all beneficial. So these forms were licked down by the cows, and then, sort of like Marcel Duchamp, I just let it happen. Well, not really. I have too much of I wanted things to, I worked on the arrangement some, but that's pretty much like it. The photograph on the left is an earlier, very early cross. This is a piece called Taste and See, which is from Psalm 34. And it's got honey in the center of it. It's core drilled, and there's a glass container in there, and that's a kind of honey that never sugars. There's one honey, Tupelo honey. When I heard Over the Rhine singing about Tupelo, I thought, are they talking about honey? What's going on here? But anyhow, it's this piece. Now, when I first exhibited it, I thought Taste and See was just the title from the psalm. People took it as a command. And so at the opening, everybody, and then they would wipe their finger on the top of the marble, and which made it really kind of fascinating, in terms of something that was actually participatory and used. But as an old modernist, it was a little bit too dirty for me. So, okay. This is another piece that I did as an undergraduate. It's a lead brick that is cast to the size of gold bullion in Fort Knox. So it actually replicates gold bullion, and I had it gold plated. Now I made this, and on one end, these are slides again that I made. You can see how crummy these are. These aren't professional photographs. But I made it, and on one end I sawed it as though it had been tested, because I wanted to we want to verify that this is gold. And on the other end I stamped numbers in, and I just made up the numbers and everything to say like this is part of an inventory. So I make this whole thing. I take it to the gold plating guy, and he looks at it and he says, I can't do this. And I'm like, why not? And he said, well, you could sell this as actual gold, because, on the periodic table, lead and gold they're not right next to each other, but they're kind of close, and you could really fake somebody out. Plus the fact that I always loved this, the alchemists in the medieval times, one of their tasks was to make lead into gold. So this was kind of working with an illusion. And I said, well, what do I have to do to get this done? And he said, you're going to have to get permission from the Treasury Department. And I was like, oh no. Well, I wrote the Treasury Department. I waited about 3 months. I got a 50-page form back, which I still have, authorizing me to make this gold bullion piece. I called it, I don't think it's a very poetic title, New Visual Value. And I was really wrestling with, both with the blade piece and with this, I was really wrestling with the place of art in the life of the artist and also in the broader art culture. This was a long time ago. I just had doubts about it. But anyhow, in terms of continuity, this is a much more recent piece. This is called The Good, the True, and the Beautiful. It's working with what in Orthodox and Catholic tradition is called the transcendentals, meaning that goodness, ethical things, truthful things, and beautiful things are found in all cultures. They're transcultural, they're truly universals in some way. At least that's the argument. So I took stones from a river that I used to play in when I was an adolescent up in New Hampshire, where I just loved all these stones that were made by, essentially glacial erosion, and then they just water running over them and stuff. So I took these 3 stones because I always loved the forms of those, and I thought, well, do these really represent goodness, truth, and beauty, and what would I have to do? And I had been working on a commission where I'd been exploring something called sputtering target, which is where you spray precious metals on forms that don't conduct electricity. Typically in plating, you're using an electrochemical charge some way, but this is a spray forms. And so I found a foundry down in near Phoenix, Arizona, and Tempe, Arizona, that was working with sputtering target. And I flew out there. I got a grant from the college, and I flew out there and left them the stones and everything. We did a test case, and everything was going to be great. And they called me, and they said, we can't get this done, you know, and we can't get it to stick. And I said, well, what are you going to do? And they said, well, we sent it to our advisors at Los Alamos, in the national lab at Los Alamos, and they sprayed it for you. But don't tell anybody. Okay, so there, because they used the Los Alamos lab to do it. This is another graduate school piece, and it was actually the sinks in the volumes of the sinks in our loft in New York City before Kathy and I moved to Baltimore. And it was something I always had my hands in, you know, all the time, washing dishes, you know, all that kind of stuff. But I never really knew it, you know, and I thought, what would it be like to know this in a very different kind of way? I want to see this. And so Kathy was gone. So one day I, you know, cast fiberglass in there, you know, greased up the enamel, you know, cast the fiberglass. Still smelled when she got home that night. It was pretty bad. But I worked on that for a couple of years, just trying to perfect the forms. But one of the things I think for me, both substantially and formally, is that art always gives you the possibility of seeing something that you can't see any other way. And that was a very early kind of thing with that. A more recent idea of something related to that, this was a cross I did called All My Sins. And I took 300-pound cold press linen watercolor paper and an indelible pen. And for about a month, I wrote down I tried to think of everything I'd ever done as a sin, which is a real fool's errand. I wouldn't recommend that you do that. But I had categories, I had specific sins, I had thoughts, you know, I just had this list that was about 3 pages. So they're all indelible ink on this cold press paper. I took it under the darkness of night. I took it to a lab at Messiah College and chopped it up into real small bits. And I had made molds for the glass, and so all 4 of these things make a cross form. I worked with a glass artist who blew glass into the molds, and then I had a paper bag and I just sprinkled all of my sins into the cross form. Then they slumped them at the end, and during the annealing process, the carbon from the paper blackened the cross, which I had no clue was going to happen, but they're all full of this ashes of my sin. So I was trying to work with sort of a theological idea. This is another piece. This is working with marble called Book of Light. Some marbles are translucent, and this I wanted to say, you know, there's always stuff hidden in materials that you're looking for. When you're looking, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here because I know Jeff has given me a time to end by. This is another piece related to that called Tabula Rasa. This is owned by an architect in the Harrisburg area. And then crosses. When I first started really thinking about the faith in light of my practices, I thought, you know, something that would be really great is I could make crosses for the church and I could update the church. Now the irony of this is that I think there's 1 or 2 crosses in churches. The church hasn't beat a path to my door for a better cross. But I've made a lot of crosses that individuals have bought and purchased and owned. When I first started, I made this piece on the left here called Icon, which is neon and a great big piece of coal, and I wasn't even thinking cross, but everybody said to me, that's a cross. And I was like, oh, gee, I guess it is, you know. So then I thought, okay, I'll make crosses that could really go in a church. I'll try to imagine what would be appealing to your average Protestant, you know, person that's scared of, quote, real art. So I made several crosses like this. This is I called Selma Cross, taken out of both Orthodox tradition and also, of course, early Italian art. And I then there was just really low response on that, so I thought, the heck with it. I'm just going to make crosses that I think really at least speak to me. These are crosses that where the body form is, I think, implicit in it. That's tarred cross on the left. It's covered with tar and was burned. And on the right, which was also covered with tar and burned, this is called harrowed cross. And the arm gestures here are from grapevine. So I was already at that time thinking about wood and the content of it. This is a more recent cross that I did from a series that I did on broken tablets. And this was for somebody in Texas. And I think that's the most recent cross I've done. That's ebonized cherry, gold-leafed thorn, and then travertine marble. So back to the pile of wood. The first public commission I did was for United States Pharmacopoeia Convention in Rockville, Maryland. If you buy aspirin or something, it'll always say USP on it. This was their headquarters, and so I wanted to do something for that. So there's this big assemblage there that goes up 3 stories, and I had totally forgotten about it, but after I did the piece at Messiah, Kathy pointed out to me, you were using apple wood way back then, because I had, you can see the apple forms there. This is the piece at Messiah College called Psalm. You can't photograph this in one fell swoop because it's a really large piece. It's in the entrance hall to a new building up in the air so that people can't get at it and climb on it and everything. And I was thinking of the way both music and spirit work through the building. So I was trying to get a sense of motion. This is looking up about 30 feet from the bottom floor at these forms that cross what they call the clouds, where they hang the lights. And it was a very gratifying piece to do, and probably only possible because I only lived 10 minutes from where it was done. Because I spent a lot of time up on lifts measuring and making sure that everything fit right. So it was fun. Spending time in an orchard, this is Ammon and myself cutting in the orchard, you really notice a lot of things. And I love trying to work with materials where my hand isn't always dictating the material. It isn't shaping the material, because that way I feel like I'm sort of participating in the bigger picture. It sounds kind of corny to say it, but I'm collaborating with the creator in some way. I'm doing things with the stuff, but I'm not just starting from scratch and saying, what can I invent? So cutting out in the orchard, I noticed, and the apple orchard, apple trees are pruned every year, and the apple trees fight back against that pruning. I just was really intrigued by those forms. I thought they were really beautiful. So I made this piece. It's called Small Worlds, and it's based on, just kind of sorting those visually in terms of what they were. So there's piece on the left is where the pruning had really killed the sucker. The piece on the right in the middle is where the sucker had started to grow out again and then had been broken off, and the piece on the right is where the suckers just had been left largely because the orchard had fallen into disuse. So the last few years that before they cut it up for housing. And this is a close-up of those 2 pieces. I had a wonderful studio assistant that was just a fanatic, and we would work on fitting them together, and she was just terrific. Okay, well, one thing I wanted to say is that, yay for Biola for, Yeah, no, seriously, and part of this, and I think it's going to be really useful in teaching, is that you now have 3, actually 4, because you have the Betty Gold piece, and perhaps more public pieces, and they're kind of an inventory of different ways of thinking. And of course, Kent Twitchell's, which I think was numero uno in the collection, is based on the Renaissance and post-Renaissance idea of pictorial space, and making something where the representation conforms to the form of what's being represented. So it's visually accurate, and it's the basis of figure drawing. It's the basis for a lot of painting, even though the painter may go off and do something else. And that to me is very, very strong and present piece. When Tom made this piece, Dan told me, I wasn't around, I would never have probably thought about this except Dan told me about it, but those are, there's 12 stainless steel forms there, and the face of those comes off. And inside each of those forms is the name of one of the apostles. Isn't that correct? Yeah. And both spring and fall, there's a food drive, and they're left open for a month, and then students put food in there, and then they close it up again. What a wonderful metaphor for both the act of the Christian life and the Christian image. And it's also kind of a metaphor for the gallery there. Now, I don't view this piece as being contextually oriented in the sense that you need to have the gallery behind it to read it. It could be somewhere else. But in terms of participation, it's very, very much a participatory piece. And then, in my piece, it's really contextually, you can't take this and just put it on any old wall. It needs the context that it's in. So it's really site-specific in a way. Something pioneered by people like Richard Serra. I don't know if you guys remember the tilted arc controversy or not, but that was really hot, And but it's site-specific in a very particular way. That's just 3 ways that students and people here can see that art has the potential to make an image. 3 ways to speak imagistically without ever using words. And that's great. It's pluralistic. And, we applaud pluralism, but I just want to say I think there may be a downside to pluralism. And this is what I've been thinking about for a long time, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this very much justice or persuade you at all. But art has always been a category that's been closed in some respect. There have been certain things that count for art and certain things that don't count for art. Now that's very much the system I was educated into. The worst thing that you could say about a painter or a sculptor was that their work was illustrative, because illustration was considered to be not art, it was commercial art. And this whole concept, I'll argue very, very quickly, the concept of art that is at the core of our institutions now is still based on the distinction between fine art and popular art. And that's the thing, I think, that for a lot of people kind of becomes a trap. I have been very interested in people who criticize that in some way, or at least suggest that it's limited. And one of them is Ernst Gombrich, one of the greatest art historians of the 20th century, for sure. And this is in the quote is the very first sentence in his introduction to his classic textbook called The Story of Art. More recently, this is Hans Belting, and a book that was very, very well received, Likeness and Presence. And if you look at the subtitle of the book, A History of the Image Before the Era of Art. And what, of course, he's suggesting there is that art's a specific way of looking at images, but it's not the only way. So that essentially what he's dealing with is the pre-art era, when the image wasn't about who the artist was, and it also wasn't necessarily about picturing reality the way Kent Twitchell's picturing reality, because it was very much based on a religious idea of invoking presence. And he argues that what changed is that likeness became the concern in Western art at the time of the Renaissance and beyond, and presence began to move away. But what I'm really interested in is just the idea that art's a limited notion, even though we don't think it is now. But I will bet almost everybody still thinks about art in some kind of linear way and wants to put themselves in the line somewhere, right? And you know, so you say, okay, Cézanne faceted, and Cézanne begot Picasso, and Picasso begot de Kooning, you know, jumping a little bit, and then you do the begats that way, just like the Bible. And if you're kind of, you know, ambitious, you think, now how do I get to the head of the line? What do I have to do to change the narrative? Now that narrative is a lot less linear than it used to be because of the pluralism, but it still, I think, operates in that way. And you know, the thing I'm thinking about is, well, what would happen if we got rid of, what if we declared a moratorium on the word art? You know, I mean, what would happen if we said, I'm not really interested in whether something's art or not? I took an aesthetics class at Messiah College by a really, really brilliant philosopher, and we had a little debate about, he thinks that's the most important question, is whether something's art or not. I don't think it is the most important question. I really think there are all kinds of, is it well made? Does it serve your audience? You know, which is a kind of a, you know, a lot of people could care less whether what they do serves their audience or not. So that's just something I would like to provoke a little bit of thought in. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.